7:05 or so just a couple minutes to get settled. I see it's getting dark where I am, but Danny and Kay are basking in the sunlight.
Is it too bright? Do I need to?
No, we don't need to see you this time, do we?
No, do I need to stop video?
No, you're fine. You're good.
I don't know. I think that's just the Jang's usual glow.
I can't see anything. I don't know what it's like.
There we go.
Oh, I see.
Oh, there's like a glow around us.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. I think it is 7:05, and so we will go ahead and get started. Really glad you can be with us, and our goal here is to be done by 8 o'clock, including time for questions. So that is the task ahead of us. We are going to record it for those who may not be able to join us. But if you have concerns about that, please reach out to the Grace Church Stanford account and let us know. Quick introduction. So my name is Brandon Farquhar. I am one of the pastors at Grace Church Stanford, but I also work with teenagers for my full-time job. And so I work with middle school and high school students. I'm going to be sharing the stage tonight with Mike Tellericio, who's also one of the leaders at our church. We are not experts in this topic, but we have given time to study and to research and had some practice talking about these issues and thinking through questions. And so to get us started, I just want to lay out two primary goals for how we're wanting to use our time. Goal number one is we're going to try to persuade you to view the Bible as a reliable historical witness and an accurate representation of the first century teaching and significance of Christianity. And that is our goal, in contrast to suggesting that you should take Christianity or the Bible on faith alone. Rather, we're going to try to argue why it might be reasonable for you to trust the Bible and think about the implications for your life. We're going to be focusing most of our attention on the New Testament, and in particular, the four Gospels, both because we need to provide some limits to our conversation, but then even more so because Christianity rises and falls based on the person of Jesus Christ. That's the testimony of Christians since that day, that it is all about Jesus. And really, that's the internal witness of the Bible itself, that the Bible claims to rise or fall based on who Jesus is. So goal number one is to try to persuade you that the Bible can be a reliable source, both in terms of history, but then especially as a representation of Christianity. And goal number two, it kind of goes along with that, is that we are really trying to avoid assumptions about the supernatural nature of the Bible, or even the existence or the activity of God. And so if you know anything about Christianity, there are some big claims about the holiness of the Bible or the divinity, the divine source behind it. But we're not going to assume those things tonight, or at least we're going to try not to. And so if you're not a Christian, or if you're not sure what you believe about the Bible, I hope that you'll find this presentation to be intellectually respectful. We're glad you're here, and really this is a commendable way to begin to consider Christianity, to really look at the source document itself, the Bible, and to see whether we could actually get to know what Christianity is all about, and especially who Jesus is. Just a couple of notes. So at the end, we're going to have a time of question and answer. And so we're hoping that you will ask questions. And so please do prepare for that. And then as we go along, you can pop your questions. I think our host of the evening, Chris Bettner, Grace Stanford, will place a Google form in the chat box. And if you'd prefer to post a question anonymously, you can just post it in that form as we go along, and Chris will collect them for us at the end. Or you can send a private message to Chris directly. So that would be question and answer at the end, but if you think of things as we go, feel free to write them down. Final note is that this is not an academic report or presentation. And so we're going to be sharing a lot of information based on academic studies and things like that, but we're not really going to be citing sources, at least not most of them. And so just understand that from the beginning, but we are really completely dependent on the study of others and learning from them. And if you want to do more of kind of direct source study yourself, we'd love to talk to you and could suggest ways to do that. All right, so to get us started here, we're gonna have what hopefully will be a little bit of fun. And so we're gonna get all on the same page here with some friendly feud. And so this will require some audience interaction. And so our topic tonight is common objections to the Bible. And so I just want to get us all on the same page that at the end of the day, many of us actually have thought through or questioned the same type of things about the Bible. There are questions we all share, and some of us might be in different places in terms of how we're thinking through the answers. But the common objections are there and they're fairly well known. And so friendly feud style here, we are going to try to name what I think might be the top 8 objections to the Bible. And so if you think you have one, you can either just call it down, or if you want to raise your hand, you can do it that way. But here we are, the game is started. Objections to the Bible. Who will take us away?
It's all
I will go.
myth.
Oh, Nithya, all you.
Oh, it's all legend or myth or just stories.
Oh, Nithya, top of the class. There we go. It was written long after the events, and it's primarily based on legend. Good. Ben, did you have one as well?
It doesn't share my modern morality.
Excellent. Ben, I'm afraid you're not quite as high on the list. But yes, it's out of date and it doesn't apply today. I will say that the point values are purely arbitrary and just, they do add up to 100 though, because we care about the details. All right, other objections?
How can a loving God have suffering in the world?
That is a good one. Let's see here. I don't have that on the list. It should be on the list though, Sal.
It was written by men, or like
Oh, yes.
people?
Here we go. Number 2, manipulated by powerful people. That either the Bible itself or what happened to the Bible over time was really a power play. Other objections?
It's been translated too many times over the years.
Here we go. Number 5, translated so many times, and so all we have is copies of copies of copies. Good.
It's caused wars.
It's caused wars. Yeah, I'm gonna put that one up here. And actually, this is probably connected with Sal's as well, that when people look at the Bible, they find a lot of contradictions and what seems to be errors in terms of who God is, how he would work in the world, how people should respond to God, and how that should affect their lives. All right, we're gonna cut the game short, but you will probably guess the other ones. Miracles can't happen. So there's a lot in the Bible that just doesn't make sense. Related to that, as we have learned and developed over time, we now know that science has disproven a lot of what's in the Bible. And so you can think about issues of creation, origin of the universe, how our world works. And then finally, didn't the Bible change over time? That is kind of similar to the translation issue, that so much has happened, we have no idea what we're reading. You know, these objections are out there. We can easily come up with them here. And so if you have these objections, please know that you are in good company. And really my expectation is that all of us here have struggled and wondered about these objections. And so we're going to try to address some of these here. If they don't get covered, and there's one of these or another one that's not listed that really connects with you, please do ask a question about it during the Q&A time. But to get us started here, we're just going to do a basic question about what is the Bible, to get us on the same basic foundation, because as you may know, the Bible is actually not a big novel like Moby Dick or even a series like the Harry Potter series, but rather it's a collection of 66 books written by 40 different authors. It was written over 1,500 years in 3 different languages, covering 3 different continents. It's made up of a variety of genres, including poetry, narrative, letters, and apocalyptic. But yet, a Christian would claim, and I think there's good evidence from reading the Bible yourself, that the Bible claims to tell one story. That despite having this great variety of origination, the storyline of the Bible is amazingly unified. And so the idea that somebody just made up the Bible, I would suggest actually doesn't hold very much water at all. All right, so tonight our basic questions are, can the Bible be trusted? That's what we're after. Can the Bible be trusted? And to do that, we're looking at 2 smaller questions. First is a question of transmission, of do we have what they wrote? And so back in the day when the different parts of the Bible were written, is that what we have today? Is it true to what the original authors wrote, or has it been changed over the years, or just lost over the years? And then the second question is, did they write the truth? So can we trust that they accurately recorded what happened or what was said, or at least what they thought happened or what they observed? And so included in the second question are several varieties of, did they lie? Were they confused? Was it just wishful thinking? Did they intend to write fiction? And so this is our main journey tonight. And so I think it's really helpful if you can keep these 2 basic questions in mind, because my suggestion is that if you can answer both of these with a fair amount of reasonable expectation, you can actually have great confidence to look at the Bible as a source for Christianity. And so do we have what they wrote, and did they write what was true? And so to kick us off with question number 1, I'm going to pass it over to Mike.
Well, guys, it's great to be able to take us through this first point here. As Brandon said, we're going to be talking about this question: do we have what was originally written when the gospel writers, the New Testament authors, wrote down initially what the New Testament was going to be, what they wanted it to be, what God wanted it to be through their writings? It's interesting because, so many of the objections that we just talked about or that people bring to bear on a discussion about the Bible have to do with questions about, can we really believe this? Is it really up to date with our morality? I know that was one of the questions that got mentioned there. The problem is we have to first answer a more foundational question before we can even get to that kind of question, because it doesn't really matter whether or not what the Bible says is true if we don't actually have the Bible, if we don't actually have what the Bible started out as, if it's been changed over time. And so, as Brandon said, our first question here really has to do with transmission, how the Bible was handed down to us over time. So we're going to consider 3 things that are some of the most common ways to evaluate historical documents, 3 categories as we make our way through this first question: gap, copies, and errors. Those are the 3 headings, and we'll go through them one at a time. But just a note really quickly up front about certainty, because what we're trying to drive at here is the historicity of the Bible that we have now. And so we're not talking, when we talk about certainty, we're not talking about what might be called mathematical or logical certainty, where we kind of expect to prove something to be true. We're not really dealing with the scientific method when we do history, right? For the scientific method, something has to be observable, it has to be measurable, it has to be repeatable. History is not really repeatable. We're kind of looking at specific events that happened in the past. And so we're talking more about what we would call historical confidence as we study this topic. The likelihood that an event actually happened based on the testimony that it was given. So for instance, I read in a book somewhere, the question was posed, did Caesar actually cross the Rubicon River? You might be familiar with that story. Did he actually cross the Rubicon River? In the author in this book, he wrote, well, it could be that he did, or it could be that somebody dressed up as him and crossed the river in his place and somehow managed to fool everybody that saw him do this, and they thought it was Caesar, but it wasn't. But it's kind of more reasonable to believe that it was actually Caesar. It wasn't some imposter, and that all of his soldiers weren't fooled. It's more reasonable to believe that it was Caesar. So historical confidence says that some people actually did report that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. We think that they were intending to report what they actually saw or what actually happened. They weren't trying to deceive or mythologize. And there's no good reason to think that they were mistaken in their report. So we can have some historical confidence that Caesar really did cross the Rubicon. That's the kind of certainty that we look for in history. So that's just a note up front. That's how our study is going to proceed. So our first issue, we might call it, with regard to transmission is the gap, the time between when the original document was written and the oldest or the earliest legible manuscript or copy that we have. Now, this may shock some of you, it may not shock others, but we're pretty sure that we actually don't have any of the original ancient writings. We only have copies, transcriptions, and we may actually never find the originals of many of these autographs. But this is actually very normal for ancient literature. Gap is extremely normal in ancient literature. A long time ago, and this is for various reasons, a long time ago, people didn't use paper. They used things like papyrus and parchment and vellum and different materials, things that could easily be destroyed, things that weren't as easily available. You may be aware, just having traveled, perhaps some of you have traveled a good bit and you've seen some ancient ruins throughout the world, and that many cities that have a lot of historical significance are kind of not the same that they used to be because things deteriorate and break apart. And so we shouldn't be surprised that that happens with these very old materials that these things were written down on. And in fact, it's actually amazing that we have so many manuscripts at this time, just based on that fact. So gap is accepted when we look for the historicity of old documents. With ancient writings, if the gap between the original writings and the copies that we have, if that's around 1,000 years, that's not really unusual. People are generally satisfied with that, as strange as that may sound to us. A 1,000-year gap for historical documents, it's kind of common. We have examples. We have a number of examples here that we could consider. There's actually so many, but the ones we'll just mention are Herodotus. His history, he's considered actually the father of history, or he wrote this account sometime around 450 BC. The earliest copy that we have is the 10th century AD. That's 1,500 years later. Plato's Tetralogies, that was written around 400 BC. The earliest copy we have is 900 AD, 1,200 years, which is kind of good actually compared to Herodotus. Julius Caesar, his commentaries on the Gallic War, those have a 900-year gap between the originals and the oldest copy. That's even better, right, than Plato. And then Tacitus, his History and Annals, that's a 750-year gap. That's considered pretty good, quite good, just in terms of the gap for these older writings, for these ancient documents. with these numbers, people are usually satisfied that they have close to what the original author wrote. With that said, you might find it interesting to note that we actually don't have writings from some people that we have that we very quickly just take for granted that we have their history. For instance, Socrates. We have nothing that Socrates himself wrote down. We have things that were written down by him, about him and about his life by his disciples, guys like Plato, but we have nothing that was written by him himself, nothing. And yet we're still willing to believe a lot of the things that were written down about Socrates. We don't believe that he was a legend. So there is no gap. There's no actual documents that we have written by Socrates. Now we'll talk about the gap for the Bible. So with the Greek manuscripts, we have Greek manuscripts within 100 years of when the originals were written. We have Latin manuscripts within 250 years, quotations, partial manuscripts within 30 years. We have fragments of manuscripts within 30 years of when the originals were written for Greek New Testament manuscripts. A fragment of the Gospel of John, that's as early as 125 AD. We have a copy. It was probably written in 95 AD, so that's 30 years, maybe 25, depending on how we date that copy. It's not long at all. It's quite amazing, the shortness, the gap there. We have whole books, what we call codices of collections of writings around 200 years after they were originally written. Whole New Testaments, 300 to 325 years, 300 to 325 AD. That's only about 250 year gaps. So in terms of the total authorship, there's good confidence that the whole New Testament was written within a lifetime of the actual events. And the Bible's gap is far smaller than the gap for any other ancient book. We can be more sure that we have what the original authors wrote regarding the ancient historical texts in the Bible than we can be of any other ancient document. It's also quite possible that we have copies of the originals. Books were far more valuable in the first century. Books are known to have been kept and preserved for hundreds of years. New Testament books were early on considered to be the Word of God, and they were even more valuable. So how many copies are we talking about? Well, we have let's put out a few as we talked about earlier. Herodotus and his histories. We have 109 copies of Herodotus. Plato and his tetralogies, we have 210 copies. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War, 251 copies, though it's interesting that we only have about 9 or 10 of those that are even legible or readable. Tacitus's Histories and Annals, 31 copies. Generally, something like that is considered enough. 31 copies of an ancient writing, that's plenty. For the New Testament, in Greek alone, the Greek New Testament manuscripts, we have 5,800 plus copies. We have over 10,000 in Latin, and we have 8,000 plus in other languages like Coptic and Syriac. 31 copies of Tacitus compared to, if we add up those numbers, we're looking at close to 20 something, to over 20,000 copies. We have 37,000 plus quotations from various church fathers having in the early part of the 2nd and 3rd centuries writing about the Bible. We have about 37,000 quotations from that time. Bruce Metzger has argued that we actually have so much that we could reconstruct. If we just took the church fathers' quotations of the New Testament, we could reconstruct just from their writings everything but 11 verses of the New Testament. And in fact, he says, so extensive are these citations, Metzger writes, that if all other sources for our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, those quotations would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. It's also interesting to note that there's this city that was discovered in the late 1800s, sometime around 1875 or so, named Oxyrhynchus. Don't ask me to spell that. I couldn't if I tried. I don't even know if I spelled it here in my notes correctly, but Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. It was basically the garbage dump for all their documents. Thousands of years ago, they would bring all their documents to this one place, stories and various narratives, and they would just dump all their documents there. And so when this place was discovered, they just started doing these archaeological digs at this site and discovering all these ancient documents, many of which have involved New Testament texts. And there's so many actually that there's still that archaeological dig is still going on to this day. We're still uncovering texts from the New Testament. Every year there's a number of books from the New Testament that are being discovered from this archaeological dig in Oxyrhynchus. So that number of 58,000 plus Greek New Testament manuscripts, it's just increasing every year. So in some sense, to kind of transition here to this last point, what's happening here is kind of like the little league home run rule in comparison to other ancient documents. You may be familiar with that rule or kind of that practice when you're in little league and you just have so many more home runs than, so many more points on the scoreboard than the opposing team. When you're like 11 and 12, the coaches, 11 and 12-year-olds, the coaches are kind of like, all right, let's not keep just hitting home runs. Let's have some compassion for the losing team. That's kind of like what's going on. It's almost kind of sad that the New Testament is running away with these statistics and such a huge disparity there between the New Testament and all these other ancient documents. But again, what it means is that we can be more sure that we have what the original authors wrote regarding the ancient historical texts in the Bible than we can be sure of any other ancient document. And lastly, before we transition here, one more thing to consider is this issue of human error. As we talk about human error, it's important to remember that we're not talking about errors with the original autographs. We don't have those. I think I might have read a note before that suggested that we did just a few minutes ago. I apologize if I did that, but we don't have any of the original autographs. We're talking about scribal errors in this last section, differences between the originals and the copies, or between copies and copies. That's what we're talking about with regard to error. Copyist errors, we might call them, but they're more properly termed variations. That's kind of more of the technical term, variations. Some people have estimated that there are about 300,000 or so textual variations between the copies that we have, 300,000 or more, which sounds like just a totally daunting, enormous number. But most of those changes are in very, very minor things like word order or other trivial matters, things like spelling or punctuation. And it's estimated that about 99% of these variations have absolutely no impact on the meaning of the texts themselves and on the New Testament teaching as a whole. And so when we compare this to the number of manuscripts, because we have so many, this number of variations, the average is only about 16 variants per manuscript. And many of them are are the same from manuscript to manuscript. So what that means is we have this 300,000 plus figure, but those aren't unique variations. Those are repeated variations. So 300,000 plus, that's a figure that's technically accurate, but not meaningful in any real sense, statistically speaking. Actually there are a lot of, the fact that we have a lot of variants variation among these texts makes it even more likely that we can identify the original wording based on these variations. It actually helps us to see what the original texts actually contained, the ones that we don't have, the original autographs. Again, examples like misspelled words or lines that start with the same word, or attempts to harmonize, or little clarifications that the scribes may have put in the margins, things like that. Because if let's say, for instance, that we only had one copy of the Gospel of Mark. If we only had one copy of a gospel account, we could hardly know what the original said based on that one copy. Was it true to the original? Was it totally different? If you have two manuscripts, then you have a little bit of a better chance of gaining clarity about the original. If you have 10, even better, and so on and so forth. And so we measure these variations based on this large number of manuscripts against one another, and it actually helps us to gain clarity about what the initial texts probably contained. When there's only about 16 variations per manuscript, on average, then we can actually gain clarity about what the original autographs contained. And so here's a quote from another New Testament scholar. He said, "If the great number of manuscripts increases the number of scribal errors, it increases proportionately the means of correcting such errors, so that the margin of doubt left in the process of recovering the exact original wording is, in truth, remarkably small." And modern analysts, again, they think that less than 1% of the New Testament faces questions due to copyist error. And of that, as we said, minor things like word order and punctuation. So one more note as we transition here. Each modern translation goes back to the original manuscripts and uses the tools, this is very important, uses the tools of textual criticism, which means, what that means is that when you pick up a copy of your English Bible, you're not opening a literary equivalent of the telephone game. Maybe you've played the telephone game where one person says something into somebody's ear and they whisper that down the line all the way, and it gets us to the end, and you got to figure out, what the original statement or phrase was based on what the last person hears. That's not what we're seeing when we open our Bibles. Our Bibles are translated based on the original manuscripts. So the idea that the Bible is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy all the way back, that's not true. Bibles are translated into English based on the initial copies, the primary copies that we have, not based on copies of copies of copies. So the verdict, if we kind of put all of this together, the verdict is that the Bible that we have today is true to what the original authors very likely wrote. We have very good reason to believe that. All right, and with that, I'll turn it over to Brandon. He'll take us through our second question. Did they write the truth?
Great. Thank you, Mike. And just a reminder that if you have questions as we go, feel free to write them down, send them in a message to the Grace Church Stanford account, or you can put them in the form that's in the chat box. And we really do invite questions, any and all questions. By you pushing back, you will likely help the rest of us think more clearly and carefully about the subject. And so question number one, do we have what they wrote? I think we would suggest that the overwhelming evidence is yes, and it far exceeds any other historical account that you already rely on. The second question we're looking at is, did they write what was true? It's an important question because who cares if we have what they wrote, if what they wrote wasn't true or reliable? Included in this question are the varieties of, did they lie? Were they confused? And so wishful thinking, or maybe even deceived? Did they intend to write fiction? Did they write the truth, or did they try to write the truth and they just couldn't pull it off? And so those are the type of questions we're looking at. Remember, we're not trying to prove it here. Instead, we're looking for reasonable evidence that gives us probable confidence. And so once again, we're just going to survey some of the ways that answer or evaluate this important question. And so here's the evidence that we're going to be looking at. Eyewitness testimony, and then how that fills out through different questions of how we can evaluate what's going on. And so first with eyewitness testimony. When we look at the Gospels in particular, there's, because of what Mike already shared about the manuscripts we have in the dating of the Gospels, we have good evidence that the first 4 books of the New Testament, these Gospels, they claim to have be written by eyewitnesses or by people who interviewed eyewitnesses. They were all written within a generation or end within the same region of the events that happened. And so people could confirm the sources. They include a ton of details about location and cultural habits. And so if you read them, they're actually not written as legend or fiction. One of my favorite examples of this from the Bible itself is this passage from the beginning of Luke's gospel. And so the author Luke here, he at the very beginning, he's laying out his process, what he's doing, how he intends his audience to receive his writing. He says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who are from the beginning, they were eyewitnesses and they were ministers of the word, and they have delivered it to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. You see the Bible itself, here's the Gospel of Luke, and he's saying, what I'm sharing with you is based on eyewitness accounts. I have looked into it, I have done the research, I'm writing it to you in an orderly fashion so that you could actually be persuaded. You see, the Bible itself invites the type of scrutiny and investigation that we're doing. And so all the Gospels actually do this. They claim to be eyewitness, and they link their integrity to that fact. And so when we think about the apostles and the disciples, who were primarily the authors of the New Testament books, all of them actually went to their death committed to this truth. Would the disciples die for a lie? Surely they are famous saints now, you know them, but during their lifetime, actually what they wrote and taught actually only gained them persecution, prison, torture, and death. And so church history holds that the Apostle Peter, for instance, was crucified upside down because he said he wasn't worthy to die in the same way as Jesus. And so one of the common objections is that the Bible has been manipulated over time. And really the idea that the Christian church, or the men in particular who were leaders of the Christian church, had any political power or social power, that wasn't even plausible until the 4th century. Actually, long after we have these original copies and the disciples' witness. And so they stuck to it until the end. And here's a quote from Chuck Colson. He was a guy who became a Christian himself and was involved in politics. And so he knew a bit about reliable witness and testimony. He says, I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. And you're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years. Absolutely impossible. And so what was going on here? They claimed eyewitness testimony. They stuck with that commitment until their death. And so were they just deceived? Was it wishful thinking? They really couldn't get away with it, though, because Jesus' death was very public, and there were eyewitnesses still alive who could have disproven their claim. And just a plug for next week, we'll be looking at the resurrection more in particular next Sunday night for our series. And so Reasonable Faith series. Tonight, it's why we should trust the Bible. Tomorrow, it's how we can really understand the evidence of the resurrection. But rather than discrediting the New Testament, the resurrection actually argues for reliability. That these claims were so huge and so early that to pull them off without any connection to actual events would have been unthoughtful. All right, and so all this to say is that the 1st century authors claimed it as history, and the people received it as that. And so the second piece of evidence as we think about did they write what was true is really the impact of Jesus. You see, there was no time for legend or exaggeration to develop over years. And so it's a popular objection that Christianity has been hijacked, that the historical Jesus actually made no claims about his divinity. He was just a good teacher, and that people then hijacked him later and made more out of him than he really was. But all the historical evidence claims that people worshiped Jesus as God and trusted him for resurrection very early on within the generation. And so there was no time for message creep. There was no way to adjust the marketing campaign. In fact, much of the New Testament deals with fixing and addressing theological errors or changes in message. And so the letters of the New Testament are actually even more reliable than the Gospels in terms of how sure we are of when they were written and how many copies we have. And what we see is that those early churches and the early apostles were actually working very hard to maintain the truth of the message. And this battle was fought time after time. And the way that they fought the battle was that they would return to the message they received through the apostles. And so really there's no historical evidence for a good teacher narrative. And so no evidence that Jesus was just a good guy and people made him more later. Rather, from the very beginning, he claimed to be God. People claimed he did miracles, and he taught people to trust him with their eternal life. And he encouraged and prepared them to suffer and die for him. And so it really can't be denied that something big happened with the historical person of Jesus, that he was able to convince and transform his original followers, and then through them to continue to have an impact that took over the Roman Empire, despite no political, economic, social power or advantage. And that impact continues today. How could that be true? A third piece of evidence that we can think about in terms of evaluating, did they write the truth, is actually the historical witnesses apart from the Bible. And so these are other writers of the ancient world. And so Jewish and Roman historians actually confirm the basic storyline of Jesus's life. And so Josephus and the Roman historians of Tacitus and Pliny, they corroborate on these facts about Jesus, that he lived, he was executed by Pontius Pilate on a cross, he had raised up disciples, he was reported to have done miracles, and he was believed to have risen from the dead. So you can know those things with pretty good confidence without ever opening a Bible. And so the idea that every now and then gets brought up, I think it's actually falling out of use for good reason. But the idea that Jesus never lived and he was never crucified, that he's a complete myth, it really doesn't make any sense. And in fact, when you look at these Jewish and Roman historians, they had no personal bias or reason to confirm Jesus' existence. In fact, usually it's the opposite, that they actually had reason to deny Jesus or tear him down. And generally speaking, if a hostile source admits a fact that is not in its favor, generally then the fact is genuine. All right, so we have the historical witness. Another one that I think is actually really helpful to talk about is gospel disagreement. This is one of those objections that comes up a lot in terms of contradictions or errors in the Bible. That what we find when we read the four Gospels is that we don't actually have harmonization. What that means is that the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are not carbon copies of each other. There was no effort to polish them up or to harmonize them. Actually, what is happening is that we have different witnesses who are reporting many of the same events in different ways. They're reporting the events from different perspectives, choosing to report different details, or even sometimes reporting a different event entirely, although similar. And so if the reports are exactly the same, it actually often means that the witnesses were coached. But actually, we don't find that in the Gospels. And so rather than gospel disagreement or these apparent contradictions being an issue, it's actually good reason to think that they're genuine historical documents. And then beyond that, most, if not all of these apparent discrepancies or errors, they've been studied and they've actually been resolved with probable and reasonable explanations. This next one is fun because, as Mike said, with the continued search for manuscripts, this is another one where we're able to continue to find more and more evidence. And generally speaking, this is a big claim, but archaeological discoveries have only helped verify the Bible. That over the long-term scope of history, what has been found has really only ever proven the Bible right in its facts, even in bizarre parts of stories. And so some of the most apparent challenges that come through archaeology is based on silence. And so through archaeology, we don't know, we've never found this place or that story that's mentioned in the New Testament. It's usually not the opposite of finding something that disproves the Bible. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of examples that I think are really fun. One of them is this pool of Bethesda. It's mentioned in John chapter 5. It's a story where Jesus interacts with a man who's been paralyzed his whole life, and Jesus heals him. And in the story of John chapter 5, the author actually goes into great detail about what this pool in Bethesda was like, including description of these 5 colonnades or porches around it. And for the longest time, scholars thought this part of the story must of course have been made up because we had no evidence of such a place having existed. But in the 9th century, Conrad Schick discovered a tank and water system, including the remains of 5 porches. You can look it up, and actually the details of this find are really amazing. Over the years, there's been a lot of question about the Roman practice of crucifixion and if it really made sense that Jesus would have been crucified and crucified in the way he was, and in particular with the nails being driven through his hands and his feet. Well, in 2007, archaeologists found the remains of a man who appears to have been crucified, including signs of nails through his ankle. There's actually an ankle bone that was found that has a nail still through it. There's even someone they found to be crucified and then buried in a tomb very similar to how Jesus's death and burial is described. All right, apologies. All of a sudden my Mac is telling me it's about to die. But no fear, Charger is here. All right, I'm sorry about that. All right, so crucifixion, we weren't sure it's true until we found the evidence. Jesus's power to resurrect. Here's a big one, because once again, I'm claiming that Christians very early on believed in the resurrection and claimed that power for themselves. Well, recently there was found a 1st century tomb dated to 70 AD, and it had the sign of Jonah on the front. Sign of Jonah is something Jesus mentions, actually. It's a sign of his resurrection, his death, and then his resurrection 3 days later. And the sign of Jonah is a fish with a person on the inside, echoing back to an Old Testament story. And in the inscription, there's a referral to God raising someone up. In 70 AD, there are people who believed Jesus was alive and who could raise people from the dead. And we know that through archaeology. We have King David, that for the longest time, there was no record of him outside of the biblical record. And so people wondered whether him and his influence was invented to inflate Jewish history. Well, that was until 1993 when an archaeologist at Tel Dal discovered a stone monument to a king from the house of David. It's a stone that had been sealed after the Assyrian destruction in the 8th century BC. When Jerusalem was destroyed, it had been sealed under the rubble, but now they found it, confirming the historical evidence for King David. Since then, they also have discovered what they think is King David's palace. This next one's very big, as you probably know from your own reading. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were found between 1947 and 1956. It's a collection of 800 documents, including texts from the Hebrew Bible. They were discovered in these caves in and around the ancient settlement in Qumran. It's on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea in the West Bank. And actually, if you've been reading the news, just recently, they have been doing work in some additional caves in the area. And they just recently found fragments from, I believe it was a couple of the minor prophets. And so work is still going here. But the reason the Dead Sea Scrolls were so important is that the documents they found inside were dated to the 1st or 2nd century BC. And so that's 100 to 200 years before Jesus. And so you have these early Jews who thought their religion was going to be wiped out. And so they hid their most ancient scrolls in these caves. And then 100 years ago, a man chasing a goat found them by accident. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found almost every book of the Old Testament. including a full copy of the Old Testament book of Isaiah. When they found that Old Testament book of Isaiah, and they compared it to the earliest manuscript of Isaiah they had at that time, which was dated to the 7th century AD, they found it was 99% consistent. And so over 900 years of copying of the book of Isaiah, consistency was upheld at 99%. There's numerous other examples confirming the details of the Old and New Testaments. So much so that Sir William Ramsay, who's really considered to be the father of archaeology, he went about wanting to prove that the book of Acts in the New Testament was a made-up document. And so he wanted to say that this account of the early church was made up. And what he did is that he discovered that the author Luke was actually a first-rate historian. That Acts spans 32 different countries, 52 cities, 9 islands. And Sir William Ramsay found not one error on people, locations, politics. He says further study showed that the book of Acts could bear the most minute scrutiny as an authority for the facts of the Aegean world, and that it was written with such judgment, skill, art, and perception of truth as to be a model of historical statement. So that's archaeology. And then finally here, just a quick one on fulfilled prophecy. As you know, the Old Testament contains many prophecies about the future, especially related to the person of Jesus. Remember back from the beginning, really the whole of Christianity and the whole of the Bible rests on the validity of Jesus Christ. And so you could say that if one person just happened to fill one prophecy, it could have been maybe a 1 in 1,000 chance, but it could happen. You could say if somebody fulfilled 100 prophecies, that might be impressive. But when you look at the New Testament, you find that Jesus fulfilled 332 prophecies, many of which he couldn't control, like the area of his birth, who his ancestors were, how and when he would die. And a really great example is from Isaiah 53. If you want to look this up later, you'll find a gripping description of a man being crucified. For many years, people thought Isaiah 53 had to be a Christian forgery. And so these early Christians, hoping to connect Jesus to the Old Testament, they must have added it in because it was so obviously talking about Jesus's death. And really, there was no way to prove it because at that time, the oldest text, the Masoretic text, the oldest text of the Old Testament was around 800 AD. And so it was after Jesus. And so who knows? But enter the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls and they found these complete copies of Isaiah, including chapter 53, dated to the 2nd century BC, it's unbelievable that this historical document would describe Jesus's death in such detail. And so with all of these, they're really just quick overviews of what's going on here. But it gives you the idea that from everything we can examine, apart from looking at the Bible as a divine book, just from the human evidence, we have every reason to think that what they wrote is actually true. And so, Mike, I'm going to pass it back to you to bring us home.
Great. Yeah. So just as Brandon was saying, to conclude here, the question, again, 2 questions. Is the Bible true and reliable? Do we have what they wrote? With high confidence, yes, we do. The Bible meets every criterion put forth by modern historians and anthropologists as being a historically reliable witness. And then with that second question, did they write the truth? Again, with high confidence, we can say yes to that. The writers at least believed so. And in many cases, they were willing to die for it. They didn't just say that they thought it was true. They gave their lives in affirmation of what they had written. Again, there's archaeological evidence that supports this, fulfilled prophecy, and not to mention the fact that billions of other people have believed in the Bible as well. Some 2.3 billion Christians around the world, even to today. So the verdict, we can trust the Bible. In fact, we can trust the Bible more than we can trust any other ancient historical document. Again, we have precisely 0 copies of anything that Socrates wrote, but we don't doubt the historicity of his life. We have nearly 6,000 copies of just the Greek manuscripts alone on the life of Jesus. And these copies are in agreement at every point down to less than 1% margin of error. The Bible is overwhelmingly reliable. But if that's the case, that the Bible is a historically reliable document and that the writings contained within are historically reliable, then it means a few things. It means that what the Bible says about itself is important. So really quickly, what does the Bible say about itself? The Bible claims to be the Word of God. You may know that passage that all Scripture is God-breathed. The Bible is the power of God unto salvation. At least that's what it says about itself. The Bible claims to be all about Jesus, to contain what we need to know about God, life, and salvation through Jesus. And the Bible claims to be written so that we might know Jesus and be persuaded to trust him with our lives. So just a very brief moment of reflection on who Jesus is, because many people in our culture have tended to reduce him to merely a good teacher. It's worth noting that there's no evidence that the gospel authors meant for us to think that Jesus was merely a good teacher. In fact, the accounts drive not at his teachings mainly, but his actions, specifically his death. And if the claims of his death and resurrection, and the claims of death and resurrection overshadowed everything else that he did in his life. So this man claimed to be God. People claimed that he did a bunch of miracles. He taught people to trust him with their eternal life, and he encouraged and prepared them to suffer and die for him. And he even rebuked them for not believing in the God of the Old Testament. So he wasn't just a nice teacher, as many people tend to think that he is. And you may be familiar with that trifold phrase that C.S. Lewis put forward as the only three potential options for how to describe Jesus, as either a liar, a lunatic who may not have been intentionally lying, but just may have been crazy, or Lord. Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. So just to consider those three options, if Jesus is a liar and the Bible is all made up, then just note that it's kind of like the biggest, longest con ever. As Brandon mentioned, he cited some Old Testament statistics. It's helpful to be reminded that the New Testament is built on the Old Testament, which means it's not only 2,000-year-old religion, it's like 4,000-plus-year-old religion, which means that if it's a lie, it's a 4,000-plus-year-old lie. That's quite an impressive lie if 2.3 billion people are believing it. If Jesus is a lunatic, well, if he's crazy, then why did what he said and taught and did make so much sense? How could the rantings of a crazy man be compiled, followed, studied, praised, universally respected, even by people who don't believe he was God initially? Jesus had a 3-year ministry 2,000 years ago, and he's the single most well-known, most talked about man to ever walk the earth. That just doesn't fit with the profile of a ranting, raving lunatic. And so I'd like to suggest that it can't be denied that something big happened with Jesus to convince and transform his original followers, and then through them to continue to have an impact that took over the Roman Empire. Despite the fact that they had no economic, political, or social power or advantage, and that impact continues to today. So the question to consider is why? Why might that be? Perhaps it's because the Bible and what it teaches is reliable. At least that's what we've been trying to show in this presentation. So I'll turn it over to Brandon at this point for Q&A time. He can lead us through that.
Great. Thank you, Mike. All right. We are at 9 o'clock. And so in terms of presentation, we have hit our mark. But for those interested in Q&A, we will stay and hope that you can stay with us. Just one more point as we close. And so if you're interested in reading more about these things, here are 3 resources that that make a lot of the same points we were talking about tonight. And so if you would be interested in any of these, feel free to reach out to us and we'll help you get connected to that. For question and answers, you're welcome to continue to ask questions. Chris will be continuing to, you can send them to him directly, or you can send them to the form and we can do it that way. I think I might end our presentation here so that we can actually see ourselves a little bit easier. But Mike, while you were talking, I went ahead and I looked through some of the questions submitted to the form. And so I can get us started, and then perhaps as we look, you can review them as well, and I'll hand some off as we go. All right, I think we can certainly also take some live questions as we go along if you prefer to interact that way. All right, so the first question to kick us off, doesn't matter which version of the Bible I read. An example, the NIV or the ESV or the KJV. I think the shortest answer to this question is not really. Not in the sense of trying to, people will make all sorts of arguments about which version is best and the differences between the different versions. As I think it was Mike who shared this section, shared about, all these versions were translated going back to original manuscripts. For the KJV in particular, that was translated from the Latin translation at the time. And so there, you might notice some differences from that place. And so a lot of the differences in the translation is language, how things are translated, how literal or how broken down the translation is. And so while it may not matter which translation you prefer to read, I think it is helpful for you to understand what you are reading. And so generally speaking, translations of the Bible can go anywhere from kind of main point or paraphrase translations. And so something like the Message or the Living Bible would be like this, where they take sections of the Bible, so verse by verse or clause by clause, and they translate what they, to their best of their ability, think the meaning of that clause was. And that gives them a lot of freedom to use modern language and things like that. And then you get to more strict translations that go word by word and translate the word by word and leave you as the reader with a little bit more work to do in terms of understanding the meaning and things like that. And so that's really the main difference between the translations. But if you have any of these, including so the NIV, the ESV, American Standard, New King James, all of these would be quite suitable translations and very good ways for you to discover who Jesus is and think about what God would say about our lives and what that means. Mike, I'm gonna pass one over to you. I think you'd be ready for this one easily, but it's, are they still uncovering new manuscripts? And how do we know if the writings are finished if they continue to discover manuscripts? And kind of a similar question was, how do we know a book wasn't lost or overlooked or an additional book was added?
Well, they're still discovering new manuscripts. Again, there's that site in Egypt, Oxyrhynchus. You can, from what I've heard, you can actually go online and search for manuscripts that are continuing to be published from the Oxyrhynchus digs. And they're showing up every year. They kind of come out with the various papyri that they find, a set of books. So it's not just Bible text, but it's whatever they find that year. They list it and they have the texts available. They make them available for review there. So yes, they are certainly still discovering manuscripts. Can you remind me again, Brandon, the follow-up questions there?
Yes, and so so if they are still discovering manuscripts, how do we know that they won't find more that would need to be added to the Bible? So how do we know the Bible is finished if they're continuing to find manuscripts?
Yeah, I would say that the texts that we have are the canon is closed, meaning the books in the New Testament and the Old Testament as well is closed on the matter of what we already have found. The texts that we have, again, there's an abundance of the copies for each of the different books in the Bible. It would be hard to find something now, having never seen a copy of whatever particular book we might stumble upon. We would have to submit that text to a whole litany of tests to verify whether or not that text should belong in the canon, in the corpus of books that we have. We would have to be able to determine some very basic things up front. For instance, when that copy was, what the original date that the copy is based off of was likely to take place, when the original was likely to be written, who it was written by. The New Testament is principally, in basically every respect, written by the apostolic witnesses, the people that Jesus either directly commissioned to be his apostles, to be his messengers and his witnesses, or apostolic men, we might say, people within that immediate circle who had the initial apostles' approval themselves, guys like Luke or Mark. So it would have, though, if we were to find any texts, we'd have to be able to determine that they were written by eyewitnesses, by the apostles themselves. We'd have to put it through a whole litany of different scruples, we might say, or scrutiny, to determine why we would add it now, all these years later, some 2,000 years later, to the canon. And then there was one other question, Brandon. I don't know if I touched on the answer there, but maybe.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And I might transition to a related question, because there's a couple questions basically related to the canon and how it came together. And so questions like, how do we know we have the right books if the church has decided what should be included or what shouldn't, and was something lost or overlooked? And so just a quick overview of the canon. So, talking about how the Bible came together in terms of which books were included is a really big topic. And so it's one we didn't cover for that reason, because it's hard to really do justice. The basic storyline is that when it comes to our Old Testament, we are basically, the Christian church is basically inheriting what the Jewish community had already established. And so there's good evidence that around the 1st or 2nd century BC, the Jewish community had already really determined what the Hebrew Bible was, what we know as our Old Testament. And so this was known as the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh. It's 24 books, but it's really the same 39 that we have. It's just divided up into different ways. Around the 1st or 2nd century AD, we do have manuscripts that were then translated into Latin. And so this is the Septuagint. And so when Jesus and many of the apostles quote from the Old Testament, they're also often doing it from the Septuagint, which is in Greek. And so then we have the Septuagint, which is basically the same thing. The Hebrew Bible we have is the Old Testament. Many of you would have questions about the Apocrypha, for instance. And so these are what you might have heard of as intertestamental books. And so books that share the history of the Jewish people kind of between the restoration of the temple with Nehemiah and Ezra, and then the coming of Jesus. It's basically about a 400-year period. And the reason the Apocrypha is in question in particular is because the Hebrew Bible that was mostly finalized in the 1st or 2nd century BC, the Tanakh, did not include the Apocrypha. Well, then the Septuagint, which was the Hebrew Bible of the 1st or 2nd century AD, did include the Septuagint. And so there have been questions about those books. But what you find is that actually, as you read from the early scholars, both Jewish and Christian, is that there was a general awareness that while those books might have been historically accurate and helpful in that way, they were not often upheld as divine scripture. And so that was really the influence of the Old Testament. And so we're really, we're not talking about it a lot tonight, because a lot of those questions were kind of answered a good bit earlier than questions of the New Testament. With the New Testament, we have this, we often have this idea that the New Testament was just these scattered books that around the 4th century AD, around the time of Constantine, maybe a bunch of people got in a room and started going through, hey, we'll have this and we won't have that. Dan Brown, I think, actually in his books, The Da Vinci Code, I think he speculates in that type of idea. But in reality, the way the Bible came together is actually much more dependable than that. And so as Mike was talking about, when we look about the New Testament and what's included, what we find is that Paul considered Luke's writings to be on equal authority as the Old Testament. Peter does the same about Paul's writings. And so a number of the New Testament books either claim for themselves or claim for others to be on par with the Hebrew Bible. The church fathers very early on start to assume a canon. So they start to assume these are the books that give us the apostolic witness of Jesus. And so Clement of Rome in 95 AD, he mentions at least 8 books of the New Testament. And then as you go from church father over the next 100 years, and so even before 200 AD, you have the church fathers having lists of at least 22 of the 27 books in the New Testament. In general, the books of the New Testament that were more under question were Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, and then 2nd and 3rd John, mostly because of questions of authorship. As Mike said, a lot of the New Testament canon was established based on whether it was written or evidenced by the early disciples, those who were actually with Jesus and saw him and witnessed his resurrection. And so really the first canon, in terms of, it just means a list of books. The first canon was actually compiled in 170 AD. It's the Meritorian Canon, and included all of the books except those ones that were still in question: Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and 3rd John. And so the idea that the canon wasn't established until a church council around, say, 325 or 363, it really isn't based on good history. The council at that time was really just affirming and clarifying what was already standard practice and had already been handed down. There's more that could be said there, and I know there could be more questions. What I will say that is, even if you exclude some of the questionable books, or if you want to include the Apocrypha, it really isn't a hindrance to you investigating who Jesus is. And so even if you have some open questions still, certainly the core books of the New Testament, those gospel accounts, are readily affirmed early on in church history as a reliable witness of who Jesus is. And so we could chat more about more questions, but that's generally the process that happened there. Mike, can you see the questions yourself, or do you want me to ask you?
If you could ask him, Brandon. Well, actually, no, maybe I can click this link here.
Yeah. Well, as you pull that up, I'm gonna tackle another question. So we have a question. Basically, the question is about what Mike was talking about, is that textual criticism, and so looking at different variants of the New Testament or the Old Testament. And we have a question in particular about a variant in the book of Habakkuk, and it's chapter 1, verse 12, and it's the difference of a statement of whether the author is saying, "We shall not die," or "You shall not die," referring to God. Obviously, that variant would portray very different meanings. Unfortunately, I really can't answer this question in particular for this reason. As I was waiting, I pulled out my copy of the Bible, and this variant in particular doesn't even make it to a footnote in our Bible. If you read your Bible, you'll notice that there are footnotes on variants, and so you'll read a footnote that perhaps this word should be that word, or there's disagreement about this passage or that passage. And so really the variants that are most evidenced actually make it to you, the reader, and so you can look into them yourselves. This variant doesn't, which makes me think that this variant is actually solved by numbers of manuscripts and things like that. And so my guess is that for this one in particular, that as they looked at all the different manuscripts they had, they could make a very reasonable decision about which one was correct. But of course, we could look at lots of these different variants in detail and get better answers for it. And so I apologize that I can't give a better answer to that, but in terms of process, that's what they would have done. And so if you have a Greek New Testament or a Hebrew Old Testament, there's far more footnotes about the textual variants than you have in your English Bible, because they've basically gone through the process a bit already. Mike, here's a question.
Yeah.
It's a question I don't know the answer to, so maybe you do. Do we have a larger number of copies of different books relative to each other? For example, do we have many more copies of Romans than we do of Ephesians? What's the book that we have the most copies of?
We do have larger numbers of different books than of others. For instance, we don't have many copies of the Gospel of Mark. not nearly as many as we have of the other three books. John, for instance, it kind of dwarfs the number of copies that we have of the book of Mark. And there's potential reasons for why that may be. It's kind of speculative at this point. For instance, you might note that if you read the Gospel of Mark and you compare it to the Gospel of Matthew and of Luke as well, but principally of Matthew, you'll notice that there's a whole ton of overlap there. So one of the theories, for instance, as to why we have so few Gospel of Mark accounts, so few of them, is just that once Matthew, which is considerably longer, began to circulate, maybe people prioritize just copying Matthew rather than Mark, since most of Mark is contained in Matthew. That's a theory, but it certainly is true that there are considerably more copies of certain Gospels or certain books in the Scriptures. Beyond that, I can't at the moment recall any other kind of noteworthy comparisons to make. But it's interesting, though, that we do have, I mentioned this earlier, that we do have codices or codexes. When you pick up a book, you note that it's a bunch of pages bound together at a spine here, where you can read all these different pages kind of in just this simple way. Many years ago, they used to write everything on scrolls, but when they came to the New Testament, at the time of the apostles writing the New Testament, the apostles kind of overwhelmingly decided to write their books on. The people copying the apostles' original autographs decided to copy them into these codices, into these books bound with a spine like this, rather than on scrolls. And so it's interesting, just the reason for why. There's some speculation as to why they may have done that. But one of the thoughts is that they did that so that they could combine not only one scroll for like the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, but that they could leave room for other books for the actual canon to be brought together. Why they would start with this format rather than a scroll. So that kind of just touches briefly on the idea that even back then when they were copying books, they were intending for the books to be combined into not a single book, but into like a corpus of books, like a New Testament canon, for instance. So I don't know if that helps, but it just popped into my head relatedly.
Great, thanks, Mike. All right, next question. I'm going to get us started here, and then I'm going to pass over to you, Mike, because this is a series of questions, particularly about the version of Jesus we would see in the books and movies by Dan Brown. But then I'll pass it over to you, Mike, in relation to some of the books of, for instance, Gospel of Thomas, Book of Judas, things like that. For those who don't know, it's been a while since I actually read Dan Brown's books or saw the movies, and so forgive me if I get the storyline a little bit wrong. But from what I remember, Dan Brown is presenting a version of Christianity where that objection to the Bible about powerful people manipulating the story for their own benefit is really what he's going for. And it's basically that Jesus had a very close relationship with Mary Magdalene, who we see in the gospel accounts, perhaps even so close that they had a child together. And then the early church fathers really elbowed Mary and her influence out of the picture and took over the influence themselves. And so this relates to the question of the canon, whether people later decided to include certain books, not others. One of the issues with Dan Brown's version of Jesus is, although his books are fiction, and they're clearly fiction as you read them, they're obviously just stories. At the beginning, he does make a pretty subtle claim about the historicity of his fiction. And so he does blur some lines in terms of what he's claiming in terms of him being a historical scholar or maybe being a fictional writer. And so that's something to keep in mind there. But one of the issues here is that when we think about the other gospel accounts, and so a lot of Dan Brown's speculation is based off of, for instance, the Gospel of Mary, which is a book that was probably written in the 2nd or 3rd century. It's attributed to Mary of Magdalene, who shows up in the four Gospels that are in the New Testament. And it's a story that basically implies that Mary had a secret vision that was given to her by Jesus, and she needed to hand it on to the disciples. And it was primarily about the need for spiritual awakening, for attaining a level of spiritual awareness and enlightenment that would then allow you to be free from the physical restraints of the body and suffering and things like that. In this way, that these Gospels, and so the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, and I believe the book of Judas is the same, they have a common characteristic to them. One, that they're generally understood to be written late, or at least as far as all the evidence we have. And so some people might claim that they were written in the first century, but we actually don't have any evidence of that like we do of the four Gospels in the New Testament. So they're generally written late. They're generally not well preserved in terms of things we were talking about in terms of copies and then variants and things like that. And generally they're not written as narratives, in the sense that they're not written as narratives of the life of Jesus. Often they're written very differently, seeming to add a little tweak to what Christianity was understanding about Jesus and Christianity at the time. And so that's really why this idea that those early church fathers, especially the councils, and so you think about the councils in the 4th century, that's a lot of where these questions come from, this like group of pastors getting together and saying these books are in and these books are out. By that point, a lot of these books were actually pretty easy decisions because of the overwhelming evidence, early evidence for the New Testament books we already have, and the lack thereof, and in fact, a seemingly disconnect of the message of what you might know as the Gnostic Gospels. Another thing just to throw in here before I pass it to Mike is that the New Testament writers that we have in our New Testament, and so the letters of Paul and Peter, they make no denial about the controversies of the early church. And so there's no assumption that everyone was on the same page, easily believing the same things and just moving along smoothly. In fact, they talk about debate, they talk about false teachers, they talk about the need to reaffirm and to go back to the early apostolic message. That was their version of the earliest manuscripts, basically. Like, let's go back to these people who knew Jesus and told us the message. Let's go back to that. And so the fact that there would be other accounts that might suggest other things about Jesus, that shouldn't come as a shock. Mike, I know you thought about this more, and so maybe you might have some helpful things to add.
Yeah, I mean, I just along the lines of, something that you mentioned earlier, Brandon, with regard to the Meritorian fragment and those few books that were in dispute, books like 2nd and 3rd John and others, Hebrews and things like that. And 2nd Peter especially, actually, it's something worth noting that there was this degree of scrutiny that even books like that were held up to by the church. It's not just that the claim that the book might make to a apostolic authorship gets it in. It's not like just because the book says that this was written by Peter means it's good. It's held up to scrutiny regardless of what the book itself claims as in terms of the authorship. And so, we mentioned this, but there are there's a lot of criteria that we could go into as to how these books were determined to be, potentially legitimate books. But 3 categories that I found helpful that actually this gentleman, Michael Kruger, in his book, Canon Revisited, where he discusses that question in detail. How do we know that the books that we have in the New Testament canon are reliable? The 3 categories that he kind of uses to walk through that question are the divine qualities of the canon. So the Bible itself is unlike other books just in how it's written and in the claims that it makes about itself and the degree to which it's willing to hold itself accountable. the divine qualities of the canon, the apostolic origins, which we've touched on, and how do we know that this book was really written by an apostle? When are the copies dated to? We kind of talked about that, but also the corporate reception of the canon, and that speaks to just the scrutiny that the original Christians put these books through themselves. That's the reason why books like in the Meritorian fragment, those books, Second Peter and the like, that's why they weren't accepted right away, because they were actually assessed and analyzed by the people within the New Testament community. And so it took some time, which is actually encouraging to know that the books in the Bible, some of those books were recognized as authoritative, we would say. They were recognized slowly over time. That doesn't mean that the community themselves determined that the books should be in the canon, that they assigned them that place, but it means that they recognized that those books were actually apostolic slowly. It wasn't just this says Peter, so it's from Peter. So that's one thing. The other thing that I want to mention is just related to the Gnostic Gospels, we would call them, like Brandon was talking about the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Peter. There's all these documents that we have that suggest that they themselves should be included, even just by the names. You know, you can recognize the Gospel of Philip, Thomas, Peter. These are like apostolic names, but which the early church recognized don't belong in the canon. Brandon gave us some reasons for that. He said just the dates that we have from them, 2nd, 3rd century, sometime markedly different than the originals. So the dates give us reason not to accept them, but also the content. Brandon touched on this, but it's very interesting when you read some of these gospel accounts, just how strange and different they are compared to the four.
Mike, somehow we lost you. You got muted there.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I don't know what happened. Yeah, so if you were to read, for instance, I pulled it up just really quickly here. The end of the Gospel of Thomas. This just doesn't sound like something that would be in the New Testament, let alone the four Gospels. Listen to this last line, this last sentence from the Gospel of Thomas. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Every woman who will make herself male, like a male, will enter the kingdom of heaven. That just doesn't sound like something that you'd find in the other gospel accounts. So not only the dates, but the content. And again, if you were to look up, for instance, the Gospel of Peter, you'll see some really bizarre things in it. What's interesting is like that the four gospel accounts that we have, which really drive towards the resurrection, Jesus's resurrection, the claims of his resurrection. What's interesting to note is that none of those gospel accounts actually give us the details of Jesus's resurrection. They just give us the details of what the eyewitnesses encountered after Jesus's tomb was empty. They don't tell us that they saw Jesus and Philip was crouching down behind the bushes and he saw Jesus come out. There's nothing like that. It's just what they stumbled upon after Jesus was no longer in the tomb. Whereas books like the Gospel of Philip, for instance, they're going to give you like the eyewitness perspective of Jesus coming out of the tomb. And so if you read it, you just find that it's really weird. Jesus, comes out of the tomb, but when you look closely, you notice that this isn't just a regular Jesus. This is like a humongous Jesus. This is a Jesus that like is physically enormous. And then you see that not only is this Jesus massive coming out of the tomb somehow, but all of a sudden behind him is the cross following Jesus. Like we don't know why the cross is following Jesus, how it's following him, why it was in the tomb with him. And then what gets even weirder is that like the cross then starts talking to Jesus, it's just, these are just weird things that we don't see in other gospels. So that's just, added reason to be skeptical of these discoveries that we may find after all these years, especially that we may find about these other books that happen to come up in discoveries or things like that. Things to be wary of.
All right, I'm gonna I'm going to bring us to a close here with basically two short questions. But as I bring us to a close, just an open invitation. If you're someone who is especially fascinated by the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary or those, I will read it with you if you will read the Gospel of Mark with me. It's really the best way for you to evaluate these things for yourselves, is actually just to read them and see which one seems like a good historical account of the life and work of Jesus. The other thing I forgot to say in regards to the Dan Brown story and the Gospel of Mary in particular is that a lot of it is built on this idea that the early church and perhaps even the disciples themselves were so patriarchal that they were actually looking down on women, looking down on Mary. But if you read the gospel accounts themselves, you don't find that at all. In fact, in the gospel accounts, like Mary as a friend of Jesus, Mary and Martha as friends of Jesus, they are upheld. In the New Testament, the letters of Paul often upholds and actually honors the women who join him in ministry. The first witnesses of the resurrection are women. And so it seems as though this apparent like divide between Mary and the apostles that the Gospel of Mary would suggest, or Dan Brown would suggest, you don't actually find it in the earliest and most plentiful manuscripts. Not that they're ignoring Mary. In fact, they're already upholding her as one of Jesus's early followers and one who has great faith and actually takes part in the work. And so I think that's just an interesting thing to add, that, and actually the New Testament and as historical documents are actually very promising for women and their role in church and their role in society. And so it could be really encouraging to actually take some time to look at that for yourself. The last two questions I think are fairly short. One is just, can we speak to the copying process at all? Were they literally taking a document on their left and writing a new draft on their right? I don't know for sure, but if I remember correctly, I think yes. Yes, they are literally sitting down line by line and somebody is repeating it. And they were doing it with great detail and intent, which is seen by the accuracy of the products that we have. The final question we'll talk about is just, how does the Bible compare to the Quran in terms of reliability? I don't really know because I haven't studied the reliability of the Quran in this detail. We're obviously dealing with slightly different books in the sense of the Quran is the testimony of the Prophet Muhammad of the revelation he received from God. And so he received this revelation, I think it was in around 630 or so AD. And so he receives the revelation. Actually, it should have been earlier than that because I think that's when he died. But he received this revelation in the early 600s, receives the revelation from God, and then writes it down in the Quran. And so in terms of a time, we're 600 years later. In terms of like things like manuscripts, like we have a manuscript of the Quran in 1300 AD. And so, you could look at things like gap and number of copies and things like that. But they are drastically different historical documents in the sense that the Bible is the collection of these writings written over a variety of periods by a variety of people, while the Quran is primarily the testimony of the Prophet Muhammad. Also, we can be aware that the Quran itself assumes a certain amount of truth and inheritance from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and from the story of Jesus as a prophet. And so there's even a lot of like connections in that way. And so certainly worthwhile thinking about, but they kind of are different types of documents. And so I think last time I checked the forum, we had covered most of the questions. If somebody wanted to ask a live question, we can stay, but I don't want to keep you. I think if there was a final word, it would be very simply that we would hope you would have heard that actually, if you were to pick up the Bible, and especially the New Testament, and if you would turn to one of the four Gospels, you could have reasonable confidence that you're hearing and listening to the writing of a first century author who spent time with a historical person of Jesus. And they saw and observed things that changed their lives, not just in the moment, but then after Jesus was gone physically, it continued to change their life, and they somehow convinced other people of the same things. All that being said is that we would suggest that if you think these claims are hard to believe, then they're probably worth investigating. And actually the best way for you to do that is to actually look at some of these historical documents yourself. And so, for instance, looking at one of the Gospels and reading through it, coming to your own conclusions about what it says about Jesus, what Jesus says about our world, whether it seems to make sense with your experience and how you view things. And if you're interested in something like that, we're going to have a course after Easter. It'll be, one of those 6 to 7 week courses where one time a week we'll get together in the evening, similar to this, and we'll read through these accounts together and ask some of the basic questions about who does Jesus claim to be? How does he try to prove that to people? What are the implications of those claims? And so if you'd like to do that either with a group, you could do it with a course, or if you'd like to do that with someone else, I think many of us here at the church, and so myself or Danny or Mike, we'd be happy to get lunch together on a regular basis and read through one of these gospel accounts. And so that's really the invitation, is that not to just believe it because of this, but perhaps because of this, you can gain some confidence to look at these books for yourself and see what Jesus was all about. Any final questions before we close? We'll see none. Thank you for coming. I know, like, taking time on a Sunday night, it comes with a cost. And so we appreciate you joining with us and listening. As we said, we're not experts at this, and so we're learning with you, but we are honored that you spent the time. If you'd allow me, just like to say a prayer at the end, because here's one of the things that, as someone who's already a Christian, we believe that if you have the chance to meet Jesus, as it were, in one of the Gospels, you would have the opportunity to actually meet Jesus personally for yourself. That we would all make the claim that by reading these accounts, these thousands of years old accounts, we have come to know God personally through his son, Jesus Christ. And that in itself is a big claim. That is a claim of faith and divinity, what we weren't covering tonight, but yet that is what we would hope. And so let me pray for us that God would use this for our good. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this time, and thank you for everyone who joined us. We pray that you would help us take serious questions seriously. That as we think about who we are in this world and our existence and our purpose, what's wrong with this world and what could be right, would you help us to take those questions seriously, to face them critically, but would you help us actually seek for answers? And so, as we've suggested tonight, we would like to find answers through your son, Jesus Christ, and how he's presented through these eyewitness testimonies in your word. And so I ask that for those of us who are already Christians, that you would help us to grow even more. And for those who might be interested or skeptical, would you give them the chance to investigate? And if they were to do that, would you meet them in that? Would they find a personal interaction with you that could be just as transformative for them as it was for the Apostle Paul 2,000 years ago? And so we ask this in Jesus' name, amen.
Well done. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
guys.
so much.
Thank you, guys.
Brandon.
It was excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very welcome.
We had a lot of guests, didn't we?
Yeah, it looked like it.